Good evening, everyone. We're very happy to welcome you to tonight's program with Richard Kreitner, author of Fear No Pharaoh, American Jews, the Civil War, and the Fight to End Slavery. I have right here. The book's title, Fear No Pharaoh, sounds like Passover, doesn't it? In a little over 2 weeks, many of us will be sitting at dining tables, Haggadahs in front of us, retelling the story of our journey from slavery to freedom. In the tumultuous years leading up to the Civil War, American Jews were also holding seders and reciting that same story of redemption from slavery. Some pointed to that story to argue that all people, including enslaved African Americans, should be free. But other Jews interpreted the Passover story more narrowly, as a story about Jewish history. They didn't see any contradiction with celebrating the Feast of Freedom by enjoying a meal cooked by their enslaved servants. And still other Jews privately opposed slavery, but nonetheless felt that as new immigrants to the U.S., the wisest and safest course was to remain quiet and stay out of the debate. This American history of opposing slavery, supporting slavery, or remaining quiet is something we'll explore with Richard. This program is sponsored by Addis Israel in Washington, D.C., and Congregation Bethel in Bethesda, Maryland. We're grateful for the support of the Addis Israel Sisterhood, the Women of Bethel, the Library Committee, and Men's Club. We also appreciate the many people who are joining us from other communities in the DC area and from around the United States and Canada. You are all very welcome. I'm Robin Jacobson, the librarian at Addis Israel. I also facilitate Bethel's book club together with Marge London. As usual, Marge and I decorated our Zoom space with backgrounds connected to our guest author's book. When you see Marge in a moment, you will find her at Fort Sumter in the Charleston, South Carolina harbor. This is where the Civil War began in April 1861. In contrast, I'm at the site associated with the end of the Civil War in April 1865. I'm in the parlor of the McLean House and Appomattox Courthouse, National Park, Virginia. This is where General Robert E. Lee surrendered the Northern Army of Virginia to General Ulysses S. Grant. The general signed the surrender documents on the two desks behind me. Before we introduce our author, let me mention the next book programs. These are in person, not on Zoom, so they are for people who live in the DC metro area. In April, we'll have two book discussions of Daniel Kellman's acclaimed novel, The Director, which is based on the bizarre World War II experience of the Austrian filmmaker G.W. Pabst. The book shares some themes with Fear No Pharaoh in that it's about making moral compromises. Our book, one book discussion will take place at Addis Israel on Sunday, April 19th. The other will take place at Bethel on Thursday, April 23rd. You can come to either one. The registration links for the director programs are in the chat. And now Marge will introduce Richard Kreitner.
It's a pleasure to welcome and introduce Richard Kreitner. Richard grew up in New Jersey and was educated at McGill University in Montreal, where he studied philosophy. His latest book, Fear No Pharaoh, has earned glowing reviews in prestigious publications and was a finalist for this year's National Book Award in History. Fear No Pharaoh follows Richard's earlier book about American history, Break It Up: Secession, Division, and the Secret History of America's Imperfect Union. He is also the author of Booked, a travel guide to literary locations around the world. And in addition to his books, Richard writes for The Nation and the Hudson Valley Magazine. He hosts a podcast called Think Back, about American history and the connections between the past and the present. Richard lives with his family in Beacon, New York, in the beautiful and storied Hudson River Valley. We are delighted to have him with us today. After Richard and Robin discuss Fear No Pharaoh, there will be time for audience questions. To ask a question, please post it in the chat box. You can submit a question at any time during the program, and we will turn to it once we reach the Q&A period. Also, we invite you to purchase Fear No Pharaoh from our local bookstore, Politics and Prose. You'll find a discount code in the chat. Welcome, Richard. Robin will bring you on screen.
So thank you, Marge. And now let's bring Richard on screen. Hello, Richard.
Hi,
Welcome.
Robin. Hi, Marge. Thank you so much for having me.
We are so happy to have you and so much appreciate this opportunity to talk to you about Fear No Pharaoh. Before we turn to the book specifically, I had a preliminary question about you and your approach to American history. I was very intrigued by a note on your history podcast page saying that you were inspired by a quote from the poet William Carlos Williams. And the quotation says in part, Americans have lost the sense that what we are has its origin in what the nation in the past has been. So I wondered, how does that quote inspire your work?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for noticing that. I mentioned that at the very beginning of when I launched this podcast about a year ago and haven't really returned to it too much. But it really does mean quite a lot to me. I uncovered it while writing a feature story for The Nation about 10 years ago about William Carlos Williams and Paterson, New York, and Alexander Hamilton. And it says to me that everything that develops, sometimes things will happen in our country, in an election or something that's described as un-American. And that always strikes me as, completely false. Things don't fall down from the sky. They're generally not imported from elsewhere, though of course there's influences that go around the globe. But I think they generally are rooted in something about our country that has perhaps been overlooked, or downplayed, or just kind of intentionally, willfully ignored. And I think that that's such a, that's a more, uncovering all of that is kind of a richer way to grapple with history to me than either, a kind of worshipful accounts in which, blemishes are just that, compared to this kind of perfection that we're often associated with the founding fathers, or the kind of, the opposite reaction, which is, can be excessively negative, and critical. I think finding the roots of our problems in the past is a more productive and useful way to kind of engage with history. So that's kind of the guiding spirit in all my books, all my podcasts, and all my writings. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, well, thank you for elaborating on that. That's gives us a sort of elevating launch pad to turn to Fear No Pharaoh. So let me ask you about that. Why did you write it? How did you come to write it?
Yeah, I took a class at McGill. You mentioned I went to McGill University in Montreal in American Jewish history 15 years ago. And we began at the beginning, 1654, Dutch Jews famously kind of arriving in New Amsterdam from Brazil, and marched through the centuries. And by the time we got to the 19th century, I just became pretty fascinated with this question of American slavery. And how Jewish Americans responded to this institution that bore some similarities, not completely identical, but with this with this trauma that they had experienced, that their ancestors had experienced thousands of years ago. So the basic operating question of the book became, what happens when a people defined by an ancient experience of slavery and subsequent millennia of oppression, insert examples, A, B, C, most recently as of that time, the Inquisition, arrives in a country and finds that slavery exists, only they are not the ones who are enslaved. They're incredibly grateful, and we're going to get to this in more detail, to be welcomed in, by the United States. The Constitution guarantees religious liberty for all, but obviously there is still oppression, but of another group of people. So I became interested in this question of Jewish abolitionists, really specifically. To what extent were they motivated, those who there were, motivated by this experience of slavery and oppression in all of Jewish history and really at the core of Jewish identity. So I wrote a paper about that, and the question just kind of stuck with me through the 2010s as Black Lives Matter kind of rose, to national prominence, and there was this very searching kind of investigation of the role of slavery and its legacy in American history even today. And I just found there's a kind of Jewish angle to that story that was missing. And the final kind of piece of it was that I wanted to broaden the cast of characters beyond just Jewish abolitionists, those whose position on the issue I, given a century and a half of hindsight, agree with and admire, to those who took a position that I find less admirable and perhaps even less easy to understand, such as being outright complicit with slavery, defending slavery, or, as you mentioned in the introduction, those who knew it was wrong personally, but didn't want Jews to speak out against it because they didn't want to draw unwanted attention to a small and vulnerable immigrant community, was a position that I wanted to try to, do the work of trying to understand and put myself into. So yeah, when I finished my last book, which you mentioned, Break It Up, it was COVID times. I had just had a kid, and everything was feeling kind of biblical, I suppose. And I just kind of was sent back to this topic that had so interested me in college.
Well, we're so glad you did. We're so glad you picked up that topic again. I am going to ask you for an overview of the book, but first, I wondered whether you would set the scene by telling us about the Jews who were living in the U.S. as the Civil War began. How many of them were there? Did they live mostly in the North or in the South? And you mentioned new immigrants. Were they mostly new immigrants?
Yeah, sure. Well, the book kind of begins in around 1848. I backtrack a little to kind of fill in the picture, but the book really begins around 1848. And at that time, around 1850, there's 50,000 Jews in the United States. And that number triples by 1860, right before the outbreak of the Civil War, when there's 150,000. 4 out of 5 live in the North, 1 out of 5 in the South. This is really the first mass wave of Jewish immigration. Most American Jews' ancestors, my ancestors, came over largely from Eastern Europe after 1880. And that's mostly where our understanding, I think, of American Jewish history often begins. One thing that really intrigues me about this story is that it gives you a kind of earlier setup to that moment. And it kind of shows how the Jewish America that my ancestors and many other peoples arrived in is kind of defined by this experience of the Civil War. And before this period, before the 1840s, most Jews are Sephardic. They're coming from Spain and Portugal, often by way of the Netherlands or by way of South America or the Caribbean. So they're emigres either immediately or their immediate, a generation right before them. They're exiles from the Inquisition. So they're suffering this, as the victims of this world historical catastrophe for the Jews. By the 1840s, you're getting more and more German speakers, more and more Ashkenazi Jews coming from Germany, from what we would now call the Czech Republic, a little bit from Poland, but really not so much just yet. And you're also starting to get Reform Judaism on the rise, which is an important kind of background for the book. It's largely a political story, but there's religious currents going through all this that I'm sure we'll get to. But Reform Judaism is on the rise, both in Europe, especially among those who are coming to the United States, and in America. And the last thing I'll kind of say to set up the book is the revolutions of 1848 play a very important role in the book. This is the liberal nationalist revolutions seeking to overthrow absolute monarchs in Europe that end up failing. And there's a large wave of immigrants coming from those countries to the United States, of which Jews make up only, a small part. But a lot of those people are coming here with ideals, liberal ideals. So while the effort to kind of overthrow monarchy in Europe was thwarted, they come to America with these ideals intact, and they look around, where can we kind of direct these energies of ours, and they find the anti-slavery movement. And that's kind of the beginning of the story of this American Jewish encounter with the political crisis over slavery in the 1850s.
It's so dramatic, and that background is very helpful. So now that we have it, why don't you give us a quick overview of the book?
Sure. It basically follows 6 characters as they navigate this, as I said, political crisis of the Union of the 1850s, of the two sides just butting heads and eventually cracking up. That's part 1, and then part 2 is the war itself. And then I follow the characters on to their demise and to the setting the stage, as I said, this 1880 moment where American Jewish history really comes into its own. And those characters I selected not to be necessarily representative samples of American Jews at the time. Half of them are anti-slavery, while that's not the case, unfortunately, when you look at the population overall at the time. But they're types. I think they're recognizable types of ways of doing Jewish politics in America. Now, they span two spectrums, I would say. One is a political spectrum from anti-slavery or abolitionists, which are two different things, but hardcore abolitionists, people fighting with John Brown in Kansas against slavery's extension to the Western territories in the mid-1850s, to on the what we would call the right, slave owners, defenders of slavery in the United States Senate and then in the Confederate cabinet, Judah Benjamin, I'm talking about, as I'm sure many listeners know. So that's the kind of political spectrum. And then there's a religious spectrum, ranging from hardcore atheists, really to a surprisingly kind of outspoken extent, reminding me at least of kind of new atheism. Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, they call themselves the infidels. And they're the person I'm talking about is Ernestine Rose, who maybe some of your listeners know. But a lot of people don't, who I've talked about the book with, and she's restoring her to kind of the American Jewish pantheon, I suppose, was one kind of goal of the book. And she's a women's rights crusader 10 years before Seneca Falls. She's a Polish immigrant. She arrives, I'll talk about all these characters later maybe, but she arrives in America and immediately starts barnstorming the country against slavery, against women's subjugation, and against organized religion, which is why she's on the far left of my religious spectrum. And then on the far right, there's an Orthodox rabbi, who Morris Jacob Rafal, who speaks out in defense of slavery, with an asterisk, during the secession crisis at the very beginning of the Civil War. So I really wanted to show the wide kind of a range of options that American Jews had at the time that they selected for how to kind of engage with the politics of slavery and then the war itself. And then against that kind of, they're in the foreground, and I'm kind of, a lot of these people didn't know each other. And I'm kind of putting them in the same figurative room together, even though most of them were never in the same literal room together. They're responding to the same, crises and events in the 1850s. So I'm kind of putting them in conversation with one another. And then behind that, there's the overall American Jewish experience of slavery in the Civil War. And then, of course, beyond that is, the times themselves, this great period of crisis and contestation and disunion. So that's kind of the story. And we follow these characters. I knit them together from 1848, as I say, till around the end of the 19th century.
The structure of the six characters, I think, works so well. And all of them are remarkable. But I thought maybe we would turn to the three battling rabbis first. And I'm going to set the scene the way you lay it out so dramatically in your book, because it's like a movie. So it's January 4th, 1861, and Lincoln has been elected president, but he hasn't yet taken office. South Carolina has already seceded from the Union, and the other southern states seem to be on the verge of seceding too. The outgoing president, James Buchanan, has called for January 4th to be a national day of prayer. And on that day, when the future of the nation is hanging in the balance, a rabbi in New York City mounts the bema and addresses his congregation and sets off a series of events. Would you tell us about that New York City rabbi and what he said?
Yeah, sure. I mentioned him. His name's Morris Jacob Rafal. He's born in Sweden. He's educated in London, and he becomes a very prominent, fairly well-paid spokesperson for British Jews, really, and kind of the most prominent interlocutor between Jews and the non-Jewish population of Britain. He then comes to America in about 1850 and becomes the rabbi of B'nai Jeshurun in New York, which is one of the most progressive synagogues in the city now, but then was quite an Orthodox one. And Rafal takes up the same kind of position as an interlocutor between Jews and non-Jews. So he's, Jonathan Sarna, the historian, has called Rafal one of America's first glamour rabbi. This kind of type of somebody who likes to kind of put himself out there as a spokesperson for American Jews. And he takes all of that prestige and all of the prestige that American Jews have as interpreters of the Old Testament, So even, even non-Jews will turn to their Jewish neighbors for an understanding of, okay, what's really going on in the book of Exodus, what's really going on in Genesis. And he takes all of that prestige that he has and puts it squarely on the side of slavery at this extremely fraught moment, as you mentioned, right after South Carolina has seceded. And at the root of this debate is, what does the Bible say about slavery? And there's anti-slavery preachers like Henry Ward Beecher, Harry Beecher Stowe's brother, who is out there saying that slavery is a sin, slavery is blasphemy. And Rafal mounts the beam, as you say, and says no, that you are the one committing blasphemy. The Torah nowhere bans slavery, and therefore it is wrong to suggest that God is against slavery. He does say that slavery as practiced in the South is not following the Torah's strictures about how slavery should be practiced, which does have certain restrictions on how cruel it can be, how long it can last, when you need to free your slaves. You need to send them away with parting gifts, a form of reparations, some have said. And he says that here's the deal. Here's how we stave off the Civil War, is the North will stop accusing the South of committing this sin against God, and the South will start practicing slavery according to Mosaic law. So he's basically trying to take Judaism and use it as glue to bind the nation together and keep the Civil War from breaking out. Of course, that does not succeed, and what does happen is that he splits the American Jewish community. And so others denounce him and say, this is a Shanda, of course Judaism, of course Torah, of course God does not endorse slavery. And that's where the book begins. That's a somewhat, known encounter if you've read much about the period, but I really wanted to kind of build it out and talk about the characters, who these people were, why was Rafal doing this? As it turns out, he's in the North, he's not in the South. He had ties to the South, but his congregants in New York were wealthy businessmen who had deep commercial ties to the South that they stood to lose if the South did secede and war broke out. So he says that he was actually put up to do this by Southern friends of his. He obviously firmly believed it, but it was meant to kind of serve this political purpose.
Yeah, it's so odd because we think of New York City as a northern city, and it is a northern city, but I learned from your book that those ties to the South were very intense,
Well,
very
you'll
strong.
learn from my first book that some in New York, the mayor of New York City, wanted to actually secede from the Union at the beginning of the Civil War, not to join the Confederacy, but to just stand apart and keep free trade between both sections. So New York was very complicated at the very beginning of the Civil War.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So after Rafal makes his sermon, and it's supposedly like the Jewish view of what the Bible says about slavery, there's a rabbi in Baltimore that responds. Who is he and what does he say?
Yeah, he's another one I want to kind of restore to the pantheon. David Einhorn is his name, and he's a Reform rabbi. So Rafal is an Orthodox rabbi, not the farthest Orthodox that you can get, which was interesting for me to discover. There are certain ways he believed in secular learning, unlike those he called the mystics of Poland, the Hasidic rabbis. David Einhorn is a very, very radical Reform rabbi. Born in Germany, educated at very Orthodox yeshivas there, but he believes in secular learning also. He wants to study philosophy. He wants to study history. And he's basically excommunicated by the Orthodox rabbis there, and he's without a shul. He falls in with some revolutionaries of 1848, and he's banned from having a synagogue. He's invited to join a congregation, to lead a congregation in Baltimore in 1855, which he accepts, and he arrives. And he gives this sermon as soon as he arrives in Baltimore, which is, of course, a slave city and a slave state at that time. And this is where my book title comes from. He says, "We fear no Pharaoh on this sacred soil of blessed liberty." So we American Jews are grateful to be here. We are free. We fear no Pharaoh. But he says he denounces in the same sermon, he denounces slavery as a sin against God. He believes, as the Torah says, that there's the divine breath in every human being. Every person is created in the image of God, black and white. And he says that slavery is a cancer on the Union. He denounces it in uncertain, in the most certain terms. And that's an incredibly brave thing to do in 1850s Baltimore. Not only a slave city, but it's the bastion of the Know-Nothing movement. This is an important part of the book, is the rise of nativism and this fear among some that the Know-Nothings, though they are largely focused on Catholics, will turn their attention next to the Jews. And, many people say, okay, slavery is wrong, it's a sin, but we shouldn't speak out because we don't want to draw anybody's attention on us. And Einhorn dismisses all of that. He's just a real idealist. And really unwilling to kind of compromise either his religious principles or his political principles. And those are really the same. He sees no kind of distinction between the two. And I'll save it for those who would like to read the book, but he ends up suffering fairly dire consequences for taking that stance. An incredibly courageous person.
Yeah, incredibly courageous. Incredibly courageous. And then, so we have Rafal and Einhorn, and then a third rabbi, Isaac Mayer Wise, gets into the mix. Tell us about him, if you would.
Yeah, sure. He's probably the most famous. He's the founder of American Reform Judaism. He, at that time, is a rabbi in Cincinnati, where I just was a week ago, actually, for the first time. And he, which is right on the border, but it's on the Ohio River, right on the border between slave state Kentucky and free state Ohio. Half of his subscribers, many of his friends live in the South. And he personally opposes slavery. He's a reform rabbi like Einhorn is. He personally opposes slavery, but he doesn't want to speak out publicly against it for a few reasons. One, as I say, he's very tied to the Upper South at least, and he doesn't want to alienate any of his congregants, any of his friends, family members even. And so he doesn't want to speak out against it. But above all, while he's a reform rabbi like Einhorn, he's much more of a kind of compromiser. He wants to build up institutions, Jewish institutions, communal, national institutions, which did not exist at the time. There was no national organization of American Jews to speak out on behalf of Jewish interests or to organize, a coherent kind of religious philosophy as the reform movement grew. And Wise wanted to do this. He wanted to create a kind of national tent. He was so grateful to the Union, to the Constitution, for bringing in American Jews. And abolitionism at this time some saw it as treason, really, as traitorous. Some abolitionists wanted to break up the United States to protest slavery. Not all of them. But Wise was very suspicious of the abolitionist movement, both because it might kind of wreck this wonderful place that American Jews had found for themselves in this country, and also because some abolitionists, many abolitionists, were deeply Christian inflected in their rhetoric. That was kind of a motivating force of the abolitionist movement was Christianity, evangelical Christianity. There was even a movement among abolitionists to make the United States, to adopt an amendment to the Constitution to make the United States an officially Christian country, which they thought would eventually kind of legislate slavery out of existence. So Wise was very suspicious of abolitionists, and therefore he wasn't pro-slavery. He was anti-slavery. He was anti-abolitionist. So Wise, when this dispute breaks out between Rafal and Einhorn, Wise wants to stay out of it. He wants Jews themselves, as Jews, in the public sphere to stay out of it. So when the Civil War breaks out, he publishes an editorial on the heels of this whole controversy about the Torah and slavery. And the title of the editorial is Silence Our Policy. Our policy should be silence. Let's not say anything about slavery. Let's not say anything about the Civil War so as not to compromise our position as American Jews in this country.
Yeah, so that sort of says it all, that title of his editorial about silence is our policy. I did wonder, though, as far as Einhorn and Wise, since neither one was for slavery, they were both, at least personally, anti-slavery. I wondered whether one of the reasons that they took different positions was that they had different ideas about what the mission of a rabbi was. That maybe Wise felt he should protect the Jewish people. That was most important, maybe. And that Einhorn felt walking in the footsteps of the prophets. I have to speak truth and righteousness, and whatever the consequences are, it's just too bad. Do you think that was part of what was going on?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I do think that is part of what's going on, that they had different ideas of what it meant to be a rabbi and what their job was in America in the 1850s. I think Einhorn, however, would also describe himself as insisting on the security and even the self-interest of the Jews above anything else. They just had differing interpretations about what that meant, So for Einhorn, it would not, and he says this more eloquently than I possibly could, it made no sense to endorse a racist regime, basically, our words, but that's what he believed. that could then turn its attention against the Jews. So in America, that was welcoming of all races and all creeds, all beliefs, all types of people, was one that was safe and secure for the Jews. In America, that defined itself by race and organized racial hatred and hierarchies of people, was one in which Jewish security could never last very long. Wise had a different belief. He saw in America where, thank goodness it wasn't the Jews who were at the very bottom of the ladder. And for once, Jews, the question of race and whiteness and American Jews in history is an interesting question. And this book kind of offers an untold chapter one of that story. Many American Jews, for the most part, were seen as white. They were not seen as anything else in the period before the Civil War. It's after the Civil War that position becomes more complicated. And Wise is very anxious to make sure that this situation continues. So while he's not pro-slavery, he is, I would say, fairly racist for his entire life. There's an anecdote where he meets Henry Wise of Virginia, the governor, senator of Virginia, and he jokes with him about how important it is to be Weiss, the German word for white, which was their name, Wise. Henry Wise, not Jewish. And he's about how an important necessity that was. And fast forward 40 years, in the 1890s, he's excoriating Booker T. Washington for mentioning Jews and Caucasians in the same sentence as if they were not the same thing. He says, no, they are the same thing. We are Caucasian. So that was a very important thing for him, was that Jews not kind of slip out of this relatively advantaged racial position that they had in antebellum America.
So fascinating. I want to ask you a question about the abolitionist movement. You alluded to it before, but it was something that really surprised me in your book. That even though there were Jews who were abolitionists like Einhorn, that the abolitionist movement as a whole was really not at all welcoming of Jews. You've said something about it, but I thought maybe you'd say a little more.
Yeah, fairly not. I mean, this was an interesting discovery for me as well. I kind of got my start, as I mentioned, in studying this period, both Jews and otherwise, and kind of admiring the abolitionists. And this is definitely a blemish on the record. Somebody like William Lloyd Garrison could be, it wasn't yet called anti-Semitic, but nakedly anti-Semitic in his writings about Jews, both ancient and more problematically modern Jews as well. When an opponent, Mordecai Manuel Noah, one of the most famous Jews before the period I'm writing, he died in 1850, was first a critic of slavery and then became a very vocal defender of slavery and an ally of John C. Calhoun. When an opponent was Jewish, like Noah, Garrison would go far out of his way to defend, to cite it and to mention it. When somebody on his side was Jewish, he knew Ernestine Rose. She was probably the first Jewish person that he ever met, and he shared a stage with her on numerous occasions. But he would never, champion her because she was Jewish. It was also the anti-slavery movement there was an overlap. There's a kind of an overlap in a Venn diagram between the abolitionist movement and the nativist movement, which is what so freaked out somebody like Isaac Mayer Wise. And with some reason, Massachusetts was the real kind of bastion of both anti-slavery and of nativism in the 1850s. And a lot of people who were anti-slavery did not have such a philosophical, idealistic perspective as David Einhorn or Ernestine Rose. They were anti-slavery because slave labor cheapened white labor. That was a major reason why people fought against slavery's extension to Kansas. And for the same reason, you might be opposed to large-scale immigration, because that too cheapened, the labor force. Excuse me. So that was one reason why Jews felt very kind of unwelcome in the abolitionist movement. And the other, as I mentioned before, was that it was very Christian inflected. It was led by many ministers, often, unconventional ones, unorthodox ones. William Lloyd Garrison's Christianity is a very peculiar kind, but it is a Christianity, and he often, espoused his movement in those terms. So if you were Jewish, the abolitionist movement was not a particularly friendly place to be before the Civil War.
Mm. And it sounded from your book that the same was true maybe of the New Republican Party, that it was an anti-slavery party, but they had trouble with the Jews, maybe not so much because they were Jewish, but because they were immigrants. Is that the case?
To some extent, the Republican Party,
Yeah.
founded in 1854, Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, places with large German and German Jewish populations, fresh immigrants from 1848, absorbed some elements of the nativist movement in some states, like Massachusetts. So there was plenty of fodder for somebody like Isaac Mayer Wise, who was already critical of the anti-slavery movement, to also criticize the Republicans. Largely, he would say things like, why do you cry out so much for the slave and not at all for the immigrant? But there were Jews at the very founding of the Republican Party as well, is a story that I tell in the book, partly because they were there. They were in Wisconsin. They were in Illinois. Abraham Lincoln had lots of Jewish friends. There were delegates at the first Republican National Convention in 1856. There were delegates at the Republican National Convention of 1860 that nominated Abraham Lincoln. Louis Brandeis's uncle and namesake, Louis Dembitz, the first translator of Uncle Tom's Cabin into German in the United States, was a delegate who formally nominated Abraham Lincoln for the presidency in 1860. There was a Jewish man named Abram Dittenhofer who sat behind the stage at Cooper Union as Abraham Lincoln launched his presidential campaign unofficially in 1860. Who then wrote a book, How We Elected Lincoln. So Jews were very present in the early Republican Party, and Wise had to really look kind of hard to try to find reasons to oppose them. I think is a little bit more of the story. The Republican Party, and then Lincoln, when he's president, is a real friend to the Jews. Maybe we'll talk about Grant's Order Number 11. But even Wise, who was very skeptical of Lincoln at the outset of his presidency, really came to respect and greatly admire Lincoln. And even at the end of his life, claimed that Lincoln had told Wise himself that he was Jewish, which is not at all the case.
Um, Maybe we should turn to some of the other characters in your book. How about Ernestine Rose? I really loved meeting her in your book.
I'm so glad to hear that. That was really my goal. As I say, she's born to a Orthodox rabbi in Poland, and who she kind of berates. This is her telling, at least. She kind of berates into teaching her Torah and Talmud, which was very unusual for a Jewish girl at the time in the early 19th century. Nonetheless, he tries to arrange a marriage for her to somebody who she does not want to marry, and so she flees her village and ends up in Berlin. She undergoes some European adventures, which I will leave to the book. She falls in with a group of socialists in London, pre-Marxist socialists, Owenites, in London, and then they come to America by boat in 1836, where they're going to plant a colony in upstate New York. Rose and her husband, I think, get the sense that these people don't really quite know what they're doing, and so they jump off that train in New York in 1836 and end up on the Lower East Side, which is already starting to develop as a Jewish neighborhood. And as I said before, she immediately starts barnstorming the country. In favor of a married women's property law, which would allow married women to keep their property in marriage, which was illegal at that point. She's successful in that before the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848. She's campaigning against slavery. She's sharing a stage with William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass. She's the most prominent woman orator of the period before the Civil War. She embarks on a lecture tour in 1854 of the South, which is quite a courageous thing to do, with Susan B. Anthony, and Rose is the star speaker. Susan B. Anthony is the campaign manager. Very prominent, a very interesting conflicted relationship to her own Judaism, which is why I suspect that you and many readers, I think, have not known her. She was kind of written out of the American Jewish story, partly because she married a non-Jew, partly because she was such a outspoken atheist. But I nonetheless believe that her Judaism, her origins, these kind of arguments with her father really shaped her in a very powerful, informative way. And we see this during the Civil War, during this moment of intense anti-Semitism in both the North and the South, when she finally speaks out, not on behalf of all these other populations of persecuted people that she had previously kind of defended, but finally on behalf of her own people. I think it's a very interesting moment. And it's interesting that it's the Civil War and this period right after the Emancipation Proclamation that brings this out in her, this defense of her own people.
Yeah, she was a great character, and I really admired her consistency. I think she was for emancipation for everyone, for
For
women,
emancipation of all
for
kinds.
right,
But the other thing I just wanted to say, she's
yeah.
been written out of the American Jewish story, but she was also written out at a very early stage from the suffragist story, from the women's rights story, by many of the people who she herself was friends and allies with, and that was partly because of xenophobia. A lot of them were anti-immigrant. Susan B. Anthony at times in really vociferous terms, and a lot of them were anti-Semitic. Rose faced a lot of kind of hostility in the women's rights movement, in the abolitionist movement, and she led a very isolated existence, specifically because she was so radical along all these fronts that most other people only checked, 2 out of 3 boxes, where she was straight down the line in favor of freedom.
Well, you did a good job in bringing her back into public view. So, Judah Benjamin, the Secretary of State for the Confederacy, is something of an enigma, isn't he? Can you tell us about him?
Sure, yeah, he wanted to be an enigma. He was in his own time, famously, widely commented on. He burnt his papers twice, which is very frustrating for we who want to write about him. But he specifically said at the end of his life that he wanted no life, no biography written about him, not even a magazine article, he said. So it's been somewhat challenging to kind of reconstruct really what made this guy click. But I think we can get kind of close. And I actually think that the Jewish angle is a very interesting way to understand him. Just as Rose has been written out of the American Jewish story, Judah Ben, you won't, there were no, there's one monument, there was one monument of Judah Benjamin in Charlotte, North Carolina, which I believe was removed. But otherwise, you don't see monuments to Benjamin in Arlington National Cemetery. You don't see them in Richmond. He's been written out of the Confederate story, the Lost Cause story, largely because he was Jewish. Benjamin, very long story. Born in the Caribbean on a British island, which ends up being very important and very useful for him. He moves to Charleston when he's 10 years old, right after the Denmark VC slave rebellion, when it is believed that his family could see the bodies of the supposed conspirators hanging in the streets from the top floor of their house. And Charleston, after this, supposed uprising, is a very terrified place, terror-stricken place. And one of his early biographers said that if you wanted an environment in which to raise a reactionary, you could hardly do better than 1820s Charleston after the Denmark VC slave uprising. He goes to Yale as the second Jewish student ever. He's kicked out of Yale under very mysterious circumstances, enigmatic circumstances, possibly having to do with gambling. I follow his most recent biographer, James Traub, in believing it's very likely that Benjamin was gay. This was rumored at the time. It explains a lot. And that might be one reason why he didn't really want to be known. After getting kicked out of Yale, he goes to New Orleans, which is a much better place to try to raise yourself up as a Jewish person, an extremely brilliant Jewish person. He quoted Shakespeare by heart. He knew ancient and modern poetry. Then Charleston is, where the planter elite, really has things kind of tied up. In New Orleans, there's a mixture of ethnicities and languages and religions, and he can rise. He buys a plantation in 1842, making him the largest Jewish slave owner at the time. He owns that for 10 years, and he sells it right after he's elected to the United States Senate. Which suggests to me, the point has been overstated, can be overstated. It suggests to me that he bought the plantation as a way of kind of cozying up with the sugar planter elite in Louisiana, and he sold it once it had served his purposes. Which is not to say that he was not a true believer in slavery. I think that he was. But I think he was an outsider. And was always seen as such, considered, thought of himself as such, and did what he needed to do in order to kind of rise in New Orleans. He becomes the most eloquent spokesperson for slavery in the United States Senate, and he ends up being, this surprises me, Jefferson Davis's right-hand man, basically through the whole Civil War, writes all of his speeches, serves as acting president, basically, when Jefferson Davis is sick, which he often is, and is really kind of the power behind the throne, and is seen as such by the Southern populace, who knows exactly who to blame when things don't go well, when there's military setbacks. Benjamin is Secretary of War at first, which he's terribly ill-suited for. He quarrels with, Stonewall Jackson, who doesn't want to hear from one person at the time called the fat Jew sitting at his desk. Benjamin knew very little about battle. And, every setback on the battlefield, every setback on the home front, shortages of bread, the failure to win recognition from European powers for the Confederacy is blamed on Jefferson, on Judah Benjamin. So he becomes really the scapegoat for the Confederacy, and that's partly why he's been written out of this story. He's a fascinating person. Morally abhorrent in many ways, but personally admirable, I think, in many other ways. He refused to kind of let any setback get him down, and he ends up being really the only leading Confederate statesman to escape federal prison at the end of the war. And again, I'll leave this to those who want to read the book. He has a whole nother chapter after the war. Very, very interesting person.
Yeah, totally fascinating. One of the things I thought was very puzzling about him was that on one hand you might be able to say, oh, he's a Southern gentleman, he grew up in the South and that's why he's pro-slavery. But you mentioned in the book that he had, as a young lawyer, a case in which he argued so eloquently for the humanity of slaves. So he really knew better. Maybe you could say something about that.
That's a very interesting moment. I mean, he's arguing in court for a very deep-pocketed client that is an insurance company that doesn't want to pay out on the policy because there was a mutiny at sea. And Benjamin's argument is that slavery is cruel and unnatural and against natural law, and therefore you should expect slave rebellions, and this insurance company should not have to pay for what is the inevitable consequence of the horrors of slavery. And he says that, and he never argued not eloquently. So it's basically a paraphrase of Shylock's speech, hath not a Jew eyes, hath not a Jew ears, which is itself a very interesting parallel given his background. There's major question marks there as to whether he actually meant that. He did own slaves, he did defend slavery in equally eloquent terms for far longer and on many more occasions. And yet that's not the only data point that we do have to suggest a certain distance between Benjamin and slavery. At the end of the Civil War, he is also the only leading Confederate to suggest that the South should give up slavery in order to secure independence. That they should free their own enslaved people and arm them to fight for the Confederacy, because Southern independence meant more to him than the existence of slavery. Jefferson Davis and others, Robert E. Lee, saw the wisdom of that position, but they knew they could never get away with it with the Southern populace, which had been reared on this pro-slavery ideology for generations, and intensely at the outbreak of the Civil War. So does that suggest that he was always against it from 1842 when he delivered that argument in court to 1865? Again, it's been overstated. Some want to say, and this goes to a very deeper theme with the book, some have wanted to say that because Benjamin was Jewish, and Jews have this ancient experience with slavery and celebrate Passover every year, that of course he was secretly against slavery and did everything he could to undermine it. I think that's overstated. I think there's very little evidence for that. I think he and most Southern Jews went along to get along, but also shared the pro-slavery ideas of their neighbors. I still think that he was less of an ideologue than he was a pragmatist. So at the beginning of the Civil War, and I know I'm going on too long about this, but he's again really fascinating. He wanted to ship cotton out from the South to London before the Union instituted a blockade that they could draw on as collateral for badly needed funds that they would need to fight the war. And everybody else said, no, there's not going to be a war. If there is a war, it's going to be short. And yeah, of course he was right. And there's several moments where he stands apart from this kind of fevered romantic dream of Confederate nationalism. I think partly because he was, in fact, an outsider.
All right. Well, I have more that I could ask you, but I think there are a lot of questions in the chat. So maybe I should take a pause and let's look at those. And Marge, I haven't been able to read them yet. So if you see
There,
any questions in the chat, go
okay.
ahead.
There are some very good questions in the chat and some comments about people. So this is, give you a break. This is interesting from someone that says the rabbi of our congregation in Savannah, Mikvah, Israel, in 1860 owned 18 enslaved persons and was the postmaster of the Confederacy, Solomon Cohen. In order to be considered white, many Southern Jews fully adopted the attitudes and behaviors of the South at that time. So that was a comment that someone had written. And then there was a lot of people have things. Here, someone said a portrait of Rabbi Weiss is on view at the National Portrait Gallery in Washington. His son-in-law founded the New York Times.
Mm,
Okay. And then this was a question. Here's a question. Were there significant differences between Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews in regard to support or opposition to slavery?
that's a good question. I don't believe so in the 1850s, but part of the story of the Sephardic Jews arriving earlier and then Ashkenazi Jews arriving later is that Sephardic Jews, in the time of the American Revolution, for instance, there was very little they could say or do about slavery. There was a little bit of an organized anti-slavery movement in the North, in New York, in Philadelphia, the types of societies that Alexander Hamilton belonged to, John Jay, and there were Jewish members who were Sephardic of those early societies. But there wasn't anything like the very large-scale abolitionist movement that developed only later when Ashkenazi Jews arrived on the scene, fresh from the 1848 revolutions. So Ashkenazi Jews, kind of German Jews, bring with them in the 1840s these political, philosophical ideals that lead them into the anti-slavery movement. But I don't think that it's kind of apples and oranges because these two waves occurred at different eras. But by the 1850s, there's really no distinction. I would say this older generation of Sephardic people have a little bit more of that kind of go along to get along attitude because they had a much smaller community, a few thousand at the outbreak of the revolution, and it's only much later with a larger population that you can even do anything to really stand out or speak out.
All right, and then this is, I thought this was interesting question. Were there any enslaved people of Jews who adopted Judaism? Do we know anything about that?
Yes, I've got a few pages in the book about that. Actually, there's a kind of semi-famous case in the literature of a gentleman in Charleston who was born in Madagascar, was sent on a slave ship across the Atlantic, and was a kind of well-known figure in Charleston who belonged to Beth Elohim. And the rabbi at the time leaves in his letters notes about this guy Billy Simon being one of the most kind of active and zealous members of the congregation, such that and he writes that this man's dying wish was to be buried in the Jewish cemetery. And people have dug into this to see where was he buried, and there's no records of it. And it's very possible and possibly even likely that he was in fact secretly buried in
Right.
Beth Elohim Cemetery, according to his wishes, which would be against Jewish law or against the law of that congregation at the time. But might have been kind of out of deference to this person. There's others. There's been books written about this about the Caribbean where it's a little bit more of a story.
Yeah.
But there are definitely examples of that.
Okay. Okay. Here's another question. Are there any interviews with Jewish slave owners and their views defending being slave owners and why? Are there
Yeah,
any?
there's no interviews that I know of. There was no project like in the 1930s. The WPA interviewed people who had survived slavery years and years earlier. There's nothing like that for slave owners, Jews or otherwise. There's other documents, however. There's letters, there's diaries, there's memoirs, lots of them. I mean, one that really struck me was a woman named Emma Mordecai, who lived outside Richmond at the end of the Civil War, and she describes what it was like when the Union Army took Richmond, and her slaves start escaping from this plantation just outside Richmond, one by one. And she writes about what it was like to kind of see them go away, and then what she took to be kind of a betrayal of trust. She thought that she was a benevolent slave owner. A lot of people, told themselves those kinds of stories. What it was like when they kind of crept away one by one, and this is the spring of 1865. Passover is coming on, so she writes in her memoir. She left this account of preparing for Passover for the first time without the help of her enslaved people. And Robin mentioned at the beginning, like without any sense of contradiction about this, they really don't see it as any kind of contradiction. And what's interesting to me, what actually demands to be explained historically, is why do we? How did it come to be that we see that contradiction? And that's a whole story really about the 20th century.
Mhm. Yeah, maybe you could say something about that because I found that very fascinating in your book that the Jews of the Civil War who were slaveholders didn't see any contradiction between the Exodus story and that themselves were enslavers, and yet they came to see the story differently.
Yeah, they didn't see it. I mean, perhaps they didn't want to. It's not like nobody saw that. There were, I quote anti-slavery Jewish writers in the 1850s and during the war saying how can you reconcile these things? It's so obviously contradictory. I'm not sure whether they didn't see it or they didn't want to see it. Either way, when you think about this kind of imaginary Seder scene, Southern Jews had Seders. They were cooked and served by enslaved people, cleaned up by enslaved people. What you have to realize is that the only people there who are thinking, well, this is darkly ironic, are the enslaved people themselves, who, after all, are steeped in the Hebrew Bible. When Israel was in Egypt land, let my people go. It's the background of all of the spirituals, that came out of slavery and really formed the basis of Black American culture, is based in the Torah, oddly enough. So they're thinking about this. They see themselves as the Hebrews. They see the slave owners as, including the Jews, as the modern pharaohs. And to the extent, that we see it the same way now, we American Jews have reappropriated this appropriation of our tradition in this wonderful, rich, complicated, disturbing sometimes cultural exchange. That's still ongoing, obviously. But that's kind of the answer to that question: is how could they not think about it? Well, these other people actually were, and that's why we think about it today.
Okay. Another question I think was interesting now that Passover's coming is, have you come across any Haggadot from the Civil War period?
Great question. No, I've not. I have not. That would be a great research project too.
Yeah. Next book.
Yeah, maybe.
Okay. And then there was something Judah Benjamin was considered for the U.S. Supreme Court, but turned it down to stay in the Senate. Um,
Sort
and
of. He didn't want to lose his lucrative law practice on the side. Probably a little bit more to the point.
and the portrait of Rabbi Weiss was carved by Moses Ezekiel, a Jewish Virginian who was a Confederate vet. I'm just reading these. Uh, and then general scholarship says that Southern Jews treated their enslaved persons the same as Christians. Um, and Okay, here's
With one exception, if I can just pop in real
yeah.
quick. Yes, that's absolutely true, and claims to the contrary tend to be wishful thinking. However, if the Jewish slave owner was practicing, they gave their enslaved people off for Saturday as well as Sunday, which they were legally obligated to do. So there is some indications in the record that enslaved people, wanted to be owned by Jews because they got 2 days off instead of one. We again, like, let's not build that into any kind of useful myth, but that there is that in the record as well.
Okay, and here's a good one. Have you read or seen the play by Matthew Lopez, The Whipping Man, a dramatic story of post-Civil War relationship between Jewish plantation slave owners and the slave he once owned, now a free man and a devout Jew? They celebrate Passover together.
Here's the rain. No, I have not. Embarrassingly, because this is the second time that I've been recommended to read that play, so I will definitely get to that.
Okay. Um, and then Dara Horn, who was another younger writer, wrote a historical novel, All Other Nights, dealing with Jews in the North and South
Yeah,
during
that's an
the.
excellent book. Really can't speak to it highly enough. I think a good kind of fictional complement to my nonfiction book. She does put Judah Benjamin at a Seder, which there's no evidence for, and I think he probably would have done everything to avoid. I wanted to mention before, Judah Benjamin's relationship to Judaism was in a lot of ways similar to Ernestine Rose's, which was very hostile, very alienated, I would say. Even though they were political opposites, they both shared this real alienation from their Jewish identity, and yet could not fully escape it. But my only qualm with that book is that I don't think Judah Benjamin went to a Seder during the Civil War.
Let me break in to ask a big picture question that pulls together some of the threads that are in some of the remaining questions in the chat. I wondered, as a former student of philosophy, did you come to any insights while you were working on the book about the evolution of moral views over time? We've been talking about the Southerners sitting at their seders, and they have enslaved people serving them, and they did not regard themselves as evil. They thought slavery was normal and acceptable. And what are we to make of that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think that it troubles this idea. It's often dismissed as woke or something to criticize those in the past, for not living up to our contemporary high-minded ideals or something. But if you look at the time, if you look at the 1850s, if you look at the 1770s when the American Revolution was going on, people were denouncing slavery in the most identifiable terms, the same terms that we would share. People knew, they knew, and yet for reasons of expediency, and Jews for their own specific reasons of expediency, they weren't the only ones who ignored what they already knew was a moral wrong, but it's Jewish inflected, which is why it's an interesting story. They ignored it for the sake of expediency because doing so would have, as I write in the book, meant becoming an abolitionist in the 1840s or the 1850s meant standing out in the crowd, and it's an armed and dangerous crowd. It's not an easy thing to do to be a radical, and you might miss a few things. Wise was right that the abolitionists had a little bit of a blind spot for the Jews. With what contemporary implications, I'll leave to all of our guests to imagine for themselves. But even Wise, by the end of the war, I said he criticized Lincoln at the start of it, but even Wise at the end of the war said Lincoln was right. And other rabbis and leading Jews said this as well, that Lincoln was right, the Republicans were right, the abolitionists were right, and we were wrong. And that's part of the reason why Lincoln becomes such a kind of object of worship for American Jews after the war. I think partly because he was more faithful to what they took to be Jewish ideals related to social justice and equality and liberty than American Jews at that time had been themselves. I think the Jewish cult of Lincoln is to some extent overcompensation for having missed something that Lincoln got.
Hmm.
Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's very rich. Well, there is plenty more to
There,
discuss and more questions in the chat that is very, very hard to leave there, but it is time to end the program.
okay,
So,
Rob, this is for
sure.
Richard. This is a sort of, someone said, I'm a member of BJ. It must be celebrating 200th anniversary this year. Also a McGill alumna. So
Oh, yes,
I thought you would like that.
that is nice. It's a wonderful school. So thank you so much, Richard, both for your wonderful book and for sharing it with us. You've been a great guest and you've illuminated for us an earlier part of American Jewish history than we usually think about or talk about. Richard, any final thoughts?
Thank you very much. There's a lot more in the book, as as you say, the war itself, for instance. But thank you so much for hosting me. I appreciate it. The idea was to kind of make it the talk of the Seder table, because the themes are so relevant, and I think it's just kind of been this huge missed story in our community. So thank you so much, everybody, for listening, and I hope you'll check out the book.